Siempre Cuba ha estado luchando por su libertad.
Murieron 100.000 personas. No pudo triunfar, pero cambió el país.
There is little question that Meyer Lansky had thoroughly corrupted Batista.
It's not a lie. They didn't promise anything. They promised a revolution. They did a revolution.
Эти ребята обязательно будут либо мучениками, либо национальными героями.
Una revolución.
Fidel Castro.
And he told Khrushchev, you should unleash the entire Soviet nuclear arsenals. Apocalypse.
Kuba lässt sich nicht in die Knie zwingen.
Today's Cuba is a curious mix of tropical paradise and quaint nostalgia. The island is renowned for its cigars, its rum, and its colonial beauty. But to understand Cuba today, you have to understand its tumultuous past, because for centuries, Cuba has been a hotbed for upheaval. How did Cuba become the hub of the slave trade? Why, of all places, did the Spanish colonial empire collapse here? And why does the United States possess a military base in Cuba at Guantanamo? Cuba bears the scars of 500 years of foreign occupation, but that does not mean that its people have ever given up their dream of freedom.
Este es un país que ha sido siempre codiciado por muchos imperios, por el imperio español, por el imperio inglés, por la Francia, la Gran Francia, y por supuesto, conquistado por España.
Es decir, es muy singular el destino de Cuba cuando es descubierta, como dicen los europeos. Yo estoy ya muy feliz de que muchos no lo digan, que habían descubierto América. Nosotros estábamos aquí antes que lo descubrieran.
Cuba is the biggest island in the Caribbean. It spans 760 miles from east to west. That's roughly the distance from Washington, D.C. to Miami. Cuba's climate is hot and tropical. The land is fertile, and the ocean surrounding it is rich in fish. For centuries, this has made Cuba a choice destination for immigrants and invaders. The first traces of human life in Cuba are more than 4,000 years old, predating the pyramids of Egypt. Cuba's native inhabitants lived in palm tree huts or caves. They subsisted on sweet potatoes, yucca, peanuts, as well as fish and game. They were also the first people to farm and smoke tobacco. On October 28, 1492, 3 caravels appeared on Cuba's horizon. The men who disembarked were unfamiliar to the islanders. They were white. They carried swords and helmets made of steel. They were Spaniards, and their leader was called Christopher Columbus.
Über Kolumbus kommen die Spanier 1492 zu neuen Inseln, wo sie noch gar nicht so klar sind, dass das irgendwie mal so was Großes wird, wie wir das später als Amerika bezeichnen.
Columbus returned to Barcelona, to his patrons, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. They had financed his voyage, but he brought back neither gold nor silver, only some indigenous Cubans, whom he called Indians. In his diary, he wrote that they would make good slaves. But the Spanish regents declared that there was to be no slavery in the New World before sending Columbus back to conquer Cuba and the surrounding islands. Their orders were promptly ignored.
Es ist wahrscheinlich so gelaufen, dass die Männer sozusagen versklavt worden sind, getötet worden sind oder als Träger zu Tode getrieben worden sind. Die Kinder sind sozusagen dann mehr oder weniger spanisch erzogen worden. Und die Frauen haben sich spanischen Konquistadorenfamilien angeschlossen.
At first, many natives welcomed the Spaniards with open arms. Once hostilities began, they did not stand a chance against the conquistadors.
Sie haben relativ wenig Widerstand gefunden, weil die militärisch halt also vollständig unterlegen waren. Und außerdem durch die schweren Pockenkrankheiten und Masern und alle möglichen Krankheiten, die die Spanier mitgebracht haben, quasi ausgerottet worden sind.
Spanish swords and European diseases killed 90% of Cuba's inhabitants within a few short years. But the exchange of diseases went both ways. For Columbus's conquistadors also brought something back: syphilis. Nevertheless, Spain's triumph in the New World was unparalleled in history. In the name of the cross, the conquistadors spread death and slavery. Due to its strategic position, Cuba played a decisive role.
El puerto de La Habana era la llave del Golfo, y a través de aquí, de este puerto, llegaba toda la riqueza de España y salía a su vez toda la riqueza de América, tanto el oro como la plata, como las maderas, como las especies.
Kuba war eigentlich ein zentraler Baustein des ganzen imperialen Systems Spaniens, jetzt mit Blick auf Lateinamerika. Von der frühen Kolonialzeit an war Havanna der zentrale Hafen jetzt für den Umschlag von kolonialen Gütern, von all den Reichtümern. Es war der Hafen, wo sich die Schiffe ein- oder zweimal pro Jahr gesammelt haben für die sogenannte Carrera de Indias, wo sie dann im Verband den Atlantik überquerten.
It took Spain barely 50 years to conquer the New World. They destroyed the mighty Inca and Aztec empires. The treasures of the New World were loaded onto Spanish galleons. En route to Spain, they gathered in Havana and added one of the island's precious plants to their cargo: tobacco. Throughout the 16th century, tobacco was Cuba's principal export. The natives of Cuba were the first to grow and smoke it. Spanish sailors and merchants took it around the globe. Because of them, Cuba became known as a tobacco island.
El tabac és una planta molt exigent que necessita d'un camperol molt actiu i molt curós en el seu tracte. O sigui, les fulles de tabac s'han de vigilar perquè només es poden tallar en el moment que estan en la maduració òptima. Per tant, sempre hi van haver esclaus en el tabac, també. Però també hi ha molts camperols independents i petits pagesos.
100 years after Columbus's landing, the natives of the Caribbean had been all but exterminated. To continue the exploitation of their new domains, Spain had to import a new workforce. Unscrupulous traders found the solution in Africa's slave markets. 12.5 million Africans were crammed into slave ships and taken to the New World. 1.5 million of them died during the journey.
La esclavitud llegó a Cuba como llegó a toda América. A Cuba llegaron casi 2 millones de esclavos. Y llegó como un negocio mercantil fabuloso, grande y siniestro.
Slavery came to Cuba very early when the Spanish took over, but it didn't develop as a major institution until after 1804, 1805, when Haiti, the sugar mills in Haiti were destroyed.
Haiti is part of Cuba's neighboring island and a French colony since 1660. While Cuba relied on tobacco farming, Haiti's staple crop was sugarcane. With sufficient manpower, it was a lucrative business. In 1789, 32,000 white settlers lived in Haiti, as did 432,000 African slaves. On August 17, 1791, Haiti's slaves rose up in revolt. They killed their masters and fought a bloody war to gain their freedom. Haiti's sugar industry was wiped out.
Això comportarà que el que era el principal productor de sucre del món desapareix durant uns anys, desapareix del tot. I els cubans es troben en condicions òptimes per ocupar l'espai que ocupava abans aquesta colònia francesa.
Was man sich auch vor Augen halten muss, ist, dass viele Migranten aus den französischen Kolonien oder aus der französischen Kolonie aus Saint-Domingue nach Kuba übersiedelten und zum einen Kapital und vor allem viel Know-how mitbrachten.
The Cubans welcomed the refugee plantation owners from Haiti with open arms. With their help, Cuba aimed to become the Caribbean's new sugar capital. But this required more and more slaves from Africa. The Haitian Revolution, however, had undermined the entire practice of slavery. There were increasing calls for the liberation of slaves. On August 1, 1834, the British declared that all slaves throughout their empire were now free. But Spain and Cuba refused to follow suit. Their sugar business depended on slave labor.
By the middle of the century, 1850, 1860, Spain had developed the sugar industry, and Cuba was the major exporter of sugar.
El sucre volia dir pels cubans la necessitat inapel·lable de recórrer mà d'obra esclava. Els esclaus entren a Cuba amb continuïtat fins més o menys als anys 60.
Slavery was a defining part of Cuban history for several centuries. Several times, historical censuses show that African slaves outnumbered Spanish settlers, but never by the margins that had made Haiti's revolution possible. Even today, an estimated 60% of Cubans are at least in part descendants of slaves.
Sin el negro, Cuba no sería Cuba. Sin el africano no tendríamos la literatura que tenemos hoy, no tendríamos la música, no tendríamos las danzas que tenemos hoy. Y no tendríamos una cosmogonía como la que tenemos hoy los cubanos. Creo que, aunque ese no es el legado mayor, ese no es el legado mayor. El legado mayor que dejaron los africanos aquí fue sudor, sangre, fabricando, creando la nación cubana.
Cuba's sugar plantations were expanding, despite ever-increasing taxes and customs duties imposed by Spain. The white settlers in Havana grew rich. The countryside was racked by poverty. Cuba's biggest sugar customer was its northern neighbor, the United States of America.
En gran part, la mateixa continuïtat del colonialisme espanyol s'explica perquè és la gran pantalla protectora de tot aquest complex esclavista cubà, i els cubans saben perfectament que si no fos per la protecció espanyola, tot aquest sistema els britànics l'haurien escombrat completament i l'haurien escombrat del tot.
For 300 years, Spain ruled over vast territories in the Americas. It was only in the early 19th century that colony after colony began to rebel against Spain. It was the beginning of the end for the Spanish Empire. Cuba remained faithful because of slavery. It alone guaranteed the huge sugar profits.
Also das war, wie soll ich sagen, war auch so eine Art Trumpf in der Hand von Madrid, dass sie immer sagen konnten, wir gucken für Ruhe, damit diese Wirtschaft auch weiter florieren kann. Und dafür haben die Kubaner auch ziemlich viel geschluckt, lange Zeit.
Cada vez más España considerará Cuba como una zona prácticamente de explotación para el desarrollo de su capitalismo un tanto retrasado con relación al resto de Europa. Y Cuba será explotada a profundidad por España.
Much like Cuba, the southern states of the U.S. depended on slavery. Many Cubans and many Southerners wanted Cuba to join the Union. This would both protect slavery in Cuba and introduce another slave state to the U.S. and hand them a majority in Congress. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, an opponent of slavery, was elected President of the United States. The southern states promptly seceded from the Union. President Lincoln mobilized the army. Thus began a long and bloody struggle. Early on in the war, Lincoln emancipated all slaves in the United States. After 4 years, the North prevailed over the South and slavery was abolished.
The Civil War in the United States created a nation that didn't have slavery, or slavery was ended. So many Cubans saw the possibility of annexing to the United States as not a good possibility. And then they began to think about, well, we have to either reform the relationship with Spain or break completely with Spain.
Already in the 19th century, Cuba was divided into an eastern and western half. The capital, Havana, was in the western part of the island. Here lived merchants of Spanish origin and the island's leading civil servants, people who benefited from the sugar trade.
Das heißt, wir haben eigentlich zwei getrennte Geschichten. Wir haben die Geschichte einer globalen Stadt, Havanna, und wir haben ein Territorium ringsherum, was, na so, ich sage jetzt ganz vorsichtig, was so vor sich hin dümpelt als Provinz.
La historia de Cuba nos dice que siempre las revoluciones se han producido desde el oriente hacia el occidente.
Cuba's slaves looked first to Haiti, then to the USA with hope, while their owners did so in fear. America's former slaves were now free and entitled to payment for their labor. But their condition barely improved. Slave owners in Cuba, however, were in trouble.
So wie ein Wink der Geschichte. Während Jahrzehnten haben die weißen Plantagenbesitzer und die Zuckeraristokratie immer einen Sklavenaufstand befürchtet. Aber dann, eigentlich wie eine Ironie der Geschichte, der erste Aufstand, es ist kein Sklavenaufstand, sondern es sind weiße, kreolische Plantagenbesitzer im Osten der Insel, die den Krieg vom Zaun brechen 1868.
Cuba's fight for freedom is forever linked with the name Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. He owned a small sugarcane plantation in eastern Cuba, but benefited little from Cuba's sugar profits. According to Céspedes, the reasons for this were Spain's excessive taxes and customs duties. On October 10, 1868, he called on all Cubans to rebel against Spain and declared the island an independent country. The next day, he freed all his slaves.
Carlos Manuel de Céspedes s'est dit « Je libère mes esclaves et c'est ma première armée ». C'est peut-être un peu cynique comme interprétation, mais je la crois vraiment proche de ce qui s'est passé en réalité.
In 1868, Spain's army in Cuba was 7,000 soldiers strong and augmented by 30,000 Cuban volunteers. Against them stood Céspedes, his allies, and their freed slaves. 12,000 men in all, most without any military experience.
Es handelte sich um einen Guerillakrieg mit sehr mobilen Einheiten auf kubanischer Seite, aber oftmals auch sehr schlecht bewaffneten Einheiten. Manchmal hatten nur wenige ein Gewehr und die meisten nur eine Machete.
A century after Cuba's War of Independence, the Cubans-made weapon was given a cinematic monument. The film La Primera Carga al Machete shows how the slave's basic tool was transformed into a formidable weapon.
El machete. Bueno, yo sé que nosotros tenemos un arma y que la sabemos usar y que los españoles lo saben y le temen como al mismo diablo.
Pronto terminará ese ridículo y criminal intento al cual han arrastrado por la fuerza a varios paisanos.
Spain sent reinforcements. 33,000 additional soldiers. Against all odds, the rebels managed to take most of eastern Cuba within just a few months. The Spanish countered by massively recruiting additional Cuban auxiliary troops. And thus, Céspedes' rebellion becomes a civil war, as Cubans fight Cubans for the future of their country.
Los españoles tenían diferentes estrategias militares que habían traído del mundo europeo, de su psicología, de sus escuelas, de sus conceptos militares, como se hacía la guerra en Europa. Y ellos consideraron, teniendo en cuenta la condición geográfica de Cuba, que es un país alargado y estrecho, que ellos podían dividir la isla.
The Spanish Army constructed a system of trenches and watchtowers across Cuba. Their plan was to divide the island and limit the war to Cuba's eastern part. The wealthy West and the capital, Havana, were to be preserved. This line of defense did little to stop the rebels. Time and time again, they broke through, burnt sugarcane fields, and killed Spanish collaborators. But terror did little but breed more terror. Soon after, the Spaniards began executing captured rebels on the spot and without trial. On February 27, 1874, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes was killed by a Spanish bullet. Deprived of their leader, the rebel army disintegrated into a multitude of smaller guerrilla groups. The rebels could no longer win the war, but neither could the Spaniards.
Militärisch sind ja diese Kriege praktisch nie zu gewinnen, sondern es braucht politisches Verhandlungsgeschick und das ist es dann eigentlich auch, was nach diesen 10 Jahren zu einem Verhandlungsfrieden führt, 1878.
Murieron 100.000 personas, no pudo triunfar, pero cambió el país. A pesar de seguir siendo colonia de España, hubo reformas muy notables, administrativas, municipales, de libertad de expresión, incluso de partido político dentro de la colonia, pero para seguir la colonia.
But Spain's reforms were half-hearted at best. Only slaves who could prove that they fought in the war were freed. The outright abolition of slavery would have to wait another 8 long years.
En aquest període no s'incorporen nous esclaus, però es mantenen els que es tenen en un període transicional en què s'apliquen normes ben conegudes en els processos d'abolició que van fent minvar l'esclavitud. L'esclavitud acaba del tot a l'any 1886.
For many rebels, the Spanish reforms were insufficient. Thousands went into exile, most to the United States. Among them was a young journalist and poet. During the war, he was arrested by the Spanish and condemned to hard labor. His name was José Martí.
Quan José Martín marxa de la illa de Cuba, en gran part per la situació política cubana, i s'estableix als Estats Units, se n'adona que una part de l'exili cubà creu obertament i expressa obertament que es vol independitzar d'Espanya per mitjans insurreccionals.
José Martí, si vous voulez, c'est un petit peu, j'allais dire, le Fidel Castro de 100 ans avant, c'est-à-dire un jeune homme de famille moyenne et qui s'est convaincu de la certitude que les Espagnols n'avaient plus rien à faire à Cuba.
Él era llamado el maestro por los hombres negros, casi la mayoría, obreros o trabajadores, empleados, que les daba clases por la noche en Estados Unidos. Fue a la vez, al mismo tiempo, un escritor de los más importantes de la lengua española del siglo XIX y un renovador de la poesía española.
To this day, José Martí's poetry is famous around the world, even if many people don't realize it. In 1929, Cuban radio singer José Fernández Díaz composed a song from part of José Martí's work. The song is called
Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera, Guantanamera.
Long before Guantanamera, José Martí was already famous for his poetry while living in exile in the United States. Many of his works focus on Cuba's hard fight for freedom, which he had personally and brutally experienced. During the war, Martí was arrested by the Spanish and sentenced to hard labor. As a poet, he used his experiences to advance Cuba's dream of freedom, and in the name of this dream, he sought to unify Cubans in exile.
He was the leader that brought together different factions within the Cuban rebels, Maceo, Máximo Gómez, and others, and brought them together to form an alliance.
While in exile, José Martí's generals planned the war for their country's liberation. Their goal was simple: to free Cuba from Spanish occupation once and for all. To achieve this, they raised money among Cuban exiles in Miami, bought weapons, and shipped them to the island in secret. Then, on April 11, 1895, Martí and the other commanders themselves landed in eastern Cuba, where they met up with veteran soldiers of Cuba's war against Spain. But it soon became apparent that Martí, a poet, was out of place among these military men.
Ist wahrscheinlich ein sehr emotionaler Mensch gewesen. Und ist im Grunde, was ja auf der Hand liegt, kein Militär. Das heißt, in der Vorbereitungszeit kann das ganz hervorragend. Alle Kommunikation, kann mit allen großen Kriegshelden sprechen und kann die bezirpsen und kann sagen, also, du musst wieder dabei sein. Aber als dann da ist und zeigen muss, dass Anführer ist, das geht nicht.
Ja, die Forschung ist sich eigentlich einig, dass so eine gewisse Todessehnsucht vorhanden war bei Martí, weil der reitet tatsächlich mit seinem Schimmel im ersten Gefecht bei Dos Rios praktisch in den Selbstmord.
On May 19, 1895, during the war's very first battle, José Martí charged between the Cuban and Spanish lines. A Spanish bullet hit him in the chest. José Martí died without seeing his dream for freedom come true.
Creo que murió como él quería morir. Yo pienso que Martí quería vivir, pero murió como quería morir. Murió en un campo de batalla. Fue la mejor de las muertes posibles para él.
Martí realmente fue un hombre que vivió nada más que 42 años. Sin embargo, dejó una obra extraordinaria, tanto desde el punto de vista político, periodístico, literario, y dejó todo un pensamiento en Cuba respecto al problema de la independencia.
The remaining Cuban generals make a martyr out of the fallen Martí. They use his heroic example, as well as terror and intimidation, to recruit new soldiers in Cuba. Their tactics were successful. Many Cubans, especially from rural areas, began to sign up to fight.
Wir dürfen auch nicht vergessen, dass sowohl die Revolution wie die Befreiungskriege ja keine Volksaufstände gewesen sind, die vom Volk ausgegangen sind, sondern von einer intellektuellen Elite. Nicht umsonst war an der Spitze José Martí und eine ganze Reihe anderer bürgerlicher Generäle, und die dann ihre Truppen sozusagen gesammelt haben und die dann unterstützt wurden natürlich von der Bevölkerung.
The Spanish army suffered one defeat after another. Once again, the Cuban insurrectionists managed to conquer large swaths of eastern Cuba. To counter these successes, the Spanish government realized that new leadership was needed in Cuba. They sent their most ruthless general to win the war by any means necessary. His name was Valeriano Weyler.
Weyler fue un hombre con métodos de exterminio. Fue el creador, el aplicador en Cuba de una política que se le conoce habitualmente como la reconcentración, un reagrupamiento forzoso de las poblaciones fuera de las ciudades y sobre todo en el campo, traerlos hacia la ciudad.
Weyler's reconcentration policy was designed to deprive the revolutionaries of their rural support base. Large swaths of Cuba were depopulated. The rural populace was forced to leave their homes and to move to the already overcrowded towns and cities. Those who resisted were immediately executed. In the deserted rural areas, everything was razed to the ground, down to the last banana tree. And when Cuba's cities had no more room for refugees, Weyler ordered the construction of concentration camps.
Flüchtlingsströme vermischten sich mit diesen Zwangsumgesiedelten, eine Dynamik in diesem Flüchtlingsgeschehen, die kaum vorstellbar ist. Zehntausende von Zivilisten strömten in die noch stehenden Städte und Dörfer, sollten dort versorgt werden, was eigentlich auf ein riesiges humanitäres Desaster hinführte. Man muss sich vor Augen halten, es wurden rund 400.000 Personen umgesiedelt und wir sprechen von zwischen 155.000 bis 170.000 toten Zivilisten. Daher würde ich sagen, heute würde wahrscheinlich die UNO eine Intervention befürworten.
An intervention could only come from Cuba's powerful neighbor, the United States. In view of the Spanish terror on Cuba, it was the rebels' last chance. To bring about an intervention, they turned to a new ally, the American Yellow Press. Cubans smuggled photos and reports of atrocities to the United States and handed them to newspapers owned by press barons Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst.
Man könnte sagen, dass das einer der ersten modernen Informationskriege war. Die revolutionäre Organisation in den USA haben in unzähligen Veranstaltungen in den ganzen USA auf den Krieg aufmerksam gemacht, haben die Presse mit Informationen gefüttert und dass es da natürlich immer um spanische Gräuel und grandiose revolutionäre Siege ging, versteht sich beinahe von selbst. Dort in dieser Propagandaschlacht hatten die Revolutionäre unbestritten die Oberhand.
Many newspapers in the United States were against Spanish control of Cuba and began to accelerate the mood of the American people and preparing the mood of the American people for military intervention.
U.S. President William McKinley was under pressure from the press. Many Americans demanded an intervention in Cuba. But McKinley did not want to drag his country into war. Instead, he sent Spain an ultimatum: free Cuba, or the United States would begin selling modern weaponry to the rebels. As a show of force, McKinley ordered one of the U.S. Navy's most modern ships to Havana in January of 1898. The USS Maine was just 3 years old, and its formidable 10-inch guns had a range of 18,000 meters. The Maine's official mission was to protect American property in Cuba.
Der diplomatische Vertreter auf der Insel insistierte bereits 1896, dass man unbedingt eine Flotte in Reichweite brauche, um eben US-amerikanische Interessen, Güter und auch die Menschen zu schützen im Notfall.
The Spanish government was prepared to meet President McKinley's demands. But the deployment of the USS Maine was denounced by the Spanish Yellow Press as an act of aggression.
La proximité déjà fait qu'on peut imaginer une visite de courtoisie, mais on peut aussi éventuellement imaginer une visite de reconnaissance. En tout cas, rien d'hostile officiellement.
It's 9:40 p.m. on the evening of February 15, 1898. The USS Maine is anchoring in Havana Harbor. Most of the 355 American sailors and officers aboard are asleep when the unthinkable happens. Without warning, a terrible explosion tears the ship in half. It takes hours before the full extent of the catastrophe is known. The death toll is horrific. 261 of the 355 men on board are killed. An investigation into the cause of the explosion begins immediately.
There are several points of view. The Castro point of view is that the United States blew it itself to justify an intervention. Some people point out that the Cubans that were fighting against Spain may have blown it up to bring about an intervention.
En mi opinión personal fue una provocación. Estados Unidos necesitaba un motivo para intervenir en Cuba y utilizó ese motivo, el motivo del Maine.
Mir erscheint es naheliegend, dass eben eine spontane Fehlfunktion die Ursache war, weil wir das auf anderen vergleichbaren Schiffen in der Zeit auch beobachten können, kam es mehrfach zu solchen Explosionen.
A U.S. warship sunk, hundreds of dead Americans. The American public was outraged. They demanded justice. After 2 years of relentless warmongering in America's newspapers, it did not take long until a culprit was found.
The immediate reaction in the United States was that this was something done by the Spaniards, that they were trying to kick the United States out of the island, and that therefore they had to do something.
President McKinley finally caved to public pressure and mobilized the army. On April 21st, 1898, Congress declared war on Spain. The official objective was to give Cuba its independence. Additionally, Congress decrees that Cuba is not to be annexed to the United States. For Spain, the declaration of war was a disaster.
Cuba es considerava part del territori nacional i, per tant, era una agressió d'una potència exterior respecte al territori nacional. Naturalment, per molts espanyols, això era considerat com una agressió inadmissible.
The Spanish army in Cuba could not last long without reinforcements from Europe. To exploit this vulnerability, the U.S. Navy quickly established a naval blockade around Cuba. Spain's own navy found itself in the same trap as its army. Its ships were anchored in the port of Santiago, the largest city in the east of the island. Following the blockade, U.S. troops landed in southeastern Cuba without encountering any resistance.
Böse Zungen behaupten, dass die USA die Insel habe ausbluten lassen in 3 Jahren Krieg und dann quasi im letzten Augenblick, bevor sowieso alle erschöpft waren, eingegriffen hätten.
In 1898, the regular American army numbered only 28,000 men, far too few for an invasion of Cuba. To bolster its numbers, volunteer units were drawn up. The most famous of these was known as the Rough Riders and commanded by Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now he volunteered for the cause of Cuban liberation. In June of 1898, the Rough Riders were the subject of one of the first films of pioneer filmmaker Thomas Edison.
Das muss also in den USA damals sehr, sehr hip gewesen sein, sich sozusagen als echter Mann dafür zu melden. Und dann hat sich Teddy, der ja an und für sich von den körperlichen Voraussetzungen her nicht ganz so doll war, hat sich eben dann als großer Jäger dafür auch gemeldet.
Roosevelt et ses Rough Riders sont envoyés à Cuba dans le cadre de la guerre que l'Amérique déclare tout à fait officiellement à l'Espagne en avril 1898.
The Rough Riders landed in Cuba on June 23, 1898. Their first mission was to take the Spanish stronghold of Santiago. The Spanish army had taken up strong positions outside the city. With the battle in full swing, Theodore Roosevelt, commanding the Rough Riders, ordered his men to storm the hills outside Santiago. Casualties on both sides were tremendous, but in the end, the Americans prevailed. The battle brought fame and distinction to Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, but their actual contribution to victory has been hotly contested.
Bueno, yo me río porque en realidad se ha hecho mucha propaganda en Estados Unidos con relación a los Rough Riders, pero estudiando incluso con algunos norteamericanos que visitaron la Loma de San Juan hace algunos años, en realidad ni siquiera los Rough Riders tomaron la Loma de San Juan. Fue una loma que está un poquito más adelante.
La bataille de San Juan, je crois que ça a été la bataille la plus importante, mais il ne faut pas s'imaginer que c'est Austerlitz ou Waterloo. Hein. C'est une petite bataille, si vous voulez. Alors évidemment, à l'échelle de Cuba, c'est très important. À l'échelle de l'Espagne, c'est important. Je pense qu'à l'échelle de l'Amérique, c'est une petite bataille, mais déterminante.
Following the victory, American troops and Cuban rebels laid siege to Santiago itself. This threatened not just Spain's army, but also its last chance of victory. The Spanish battle fleet still lay at anchor in Santiago Harbor. The fleet was outgunned by the U.S. Navy, blockading the harbor. But Spain's vessels, a mix of cruisers and destroyers, were more modern. Breaking out to the open sea was their only chance. On July 3, 1898, the Spanish fleet steamed out of the harbor to attempt the breakout.
Gerade diese eher kleineren Schiffe hätten dann ja mit ihrer Mobilität den Nachteil wieder wettmachen sollen und über die Geschwindigkeit sich wieder einen taktischen Vorteil erarbeiten sollen. Das Problem war nur, dass beispielsweise bereits die hochwertige Kohle fehlte, um überhaupt Spitzengeschwindigkeiten mit diesen Schiffen zu erreichen. Und dazu kamen noch ungenügend ausgebildete Seeleute.
The Spanish fleet included the armored cruiser Vizcaya, seen here in 1898. But the Spanish fleet soon found itself in dire straits. Because it was so brand new, many gun turrets had simply not been finished. The cannons that were able to fire, sure enough, hit their targets, but most of the ammunition carried by the Spanish ships were filled with sawdust. These dummy grenades rained down on the American ships with little effect. The U.S. fleet had no such problems. The entire Spanish fleet perished in a battle lasting barely 2 hours. 323 Spanish sailors were killed. 1,729 were taken prisoner. On the other side, a single U.S. sailor was killed and 1 other wounded. Deprived of its fleet, the war was over for Spain.
Das ist ein absolut tiefster Einschnitt für die spanische Geschichte. Also im Grunde gibt es eine spanische Geschichte vor 1898, Kolonialreich, und nach 1898 im Grunde ein europäisches Mittelland, was eine Randlage hat und absolut nicht mehr zentral ist.
Spain surrendered and Cuba was jubilant. The Spanish flag in Havana was lowered for the last time on August 13th, 1898. But Cuba's dream of freedom did not come true. Hoisted instead of the Spanish flag was not that of Cuba, but that of the United States. Previously a Spanish colony, Cuba was now an American protectorate.
There was significant discussion among Cuban historians whether the Cubans would have defeated anyway Spain had the war continued. Others said that no, the United States played a key role. But the nationalistic historians and later on some of the Marxist historians said that, well, the Cubans would have won the war, that the United States took advantage to conquer Cuba and take over Cuba. So there are different interpretations to what happened there.
Victory over Spain helped open the White House doors to Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901. As promised before the war, Cuba was to become independent under his presidency. But by now, American companies had taken control of a large part of the Cuban economy.
Para 1898, la opinión del pueblo cubano sobre el gobierno de los Estados Unidos y su ejército es una opinión positiva.
Jusqu'à 1898, les Américains, c'est les anti-espagnols. Donc l'image des Américains est excellente. Bon, il est clair qu'à partir de 1898, et en tout cas pendant les années où ils exercent une domination militaire, puis un protectorat politique, il est clair que leur image, je dirais presque, s'effondre.
Pour les Américains, Cuba a toujours été historiquement une terre au fond qui était une espèce d'appendice des États-Unis. Et c'est vrai qu'une fois que les Espagnols sont partis, eh bien, ils ont toujours eu un regard sur Cuba comme étant un peu un département américain. Donc ce n'est pas une colonie, mais ça lui ressemble quand même bigrement.
The United States had gone from being Cuba's liberators to its occupiers. But Cubans were not content to endure further foreign rule. And after all, hadn't the Americans waged war against Spain to free Cuba? In exchange for withdrawing their troops, the United States government demanded serious guarantees.
Another thing they did was the creation of a constitutional convention. So the Cubans got together and began to write a constitution for Cuba in 1901. At that point, a number of congressmen, led by a senator named Orville Platt, decided that in order to give Cuba its independence and the United States to withdraw, they have to have certain guarantees that American property would be protected, and if not, the U.S. would have the right to intervene.
When the Cubans learned this, they immediately rejected the idea. Under the Platt Amendment, Cuba would not be a free country. And yet, as they well knew, without concessions to Washington, there would be no withdrawal of U.S. troops.
The Cubans voted on it and accepted. Many of them protested, but they accepted as a way of ending the war and ending the occupation of the U.S.
The Platt Amendment also authorized the United States to establish military bases in Cuba. Among other locations, the Americans chose Guantanamo Bay in the extreme southeast of the island. The bay features a natural deep harbor, ideal for sheltering even large warships.
Cuba tenía que ceder territorio para la actual base naval de Guantánamo, pues Estados Unidos fue concretando su control sobre Cuba.
Ya desde el siglo XVIII, las potencias que están interesadas en el control del Caribe por el área de interés para la comunicación con el resto de América, tenían sus intereses puestos en Guantánamo.
At Guantanamo, the U.S. Navy built their biggest naval base outside the USA. At the same time, they began construction of the Panama Canal, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. From Guantanamo, the American Navy could control all shipping in the Caribbean.
One of the interests of the United States was to protect the Panama Canal, which was at the time beginning to be built. So having naval stations in the Caribbean would protect the entrance to the Panama Canal in the Caribbean. So that was a strategic interest of the United States then.
The U.S. has leased the Guantanamo Bay base from Cuba in perpetuity since 1903 for an annual rent of $4,085. The base itself is huge and features many amenities for U.S. sailors, like the only McDonald's restaurant in Cuba. But internationally, Guantanamo became infamously known for its prison camps and the human rights abuses committed here. Then, as well as now, the issue of Guantanamo is a flashpoint of tension between the United States and Cuba.
Il y a des Américains armés, c'est-à-dire donc des gens qui manifestent une forme de souveraineté, qui sont implantés sur le territoire de Cuba. Alors il y a d'autres Américains, il y a les gens qui sont dans les sucreries, il y a des gens qui font des affaires, mais c'est pas la même chose. Là, on est dans le commerce, alors que la base de Guantanamo manifeste une souveraineté.
In 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt authorized elections in Cuba. On December 31st, 1901, Cubans were allowed to vote for their president for the first time. But as a sign of protest against the USA, the most promising candidate, a general of the Wars of Independence, withdrew his candidacy. The only remaining candidate was Tomás Estrada Palma, a Cuban living in exile in the United States.
Tomás Estrada Palma had lived most of his time in the United States. He was a teacher in Philadelphia, didn't participate actively in the war.
Facing no opposition, Estrada Palma's victory was inevitable. Almost 3/4 of Cubans voted for him. The other votes were blank or invalid. Through his military commander in Cuba, President Roosevelt sent his congratulations.
Tomás Estrada Palma, à mes yeux, est l'un de ces présidents qui ont été, en somme, ne disons pas installés par les États-Unis, puisque la Constitution prévoit une représentation parlementaire, etc. Mais il est clair que c'est le premier président de Cuba sous l'amendement Platt.
Under Estrada and his successors, Cuba remained largely under American influence. In homage to the USS Maine victims, a monument was erected in the center of Havana, an American eagle to watch over Cuba.
Kuba war nie unabhängig. Mit Ausnahme eines kleinen historischen Momentes wirklich nach den Befreiungskriegen. Aber schon haben die USA interveniert und haben Kuba sozusagen in ihre Zwänge genommen.
Salimos de la dependencia colonial española y entramos en la dependencia semicolonial norteamericana. Así que siempre Cuba ha estado luchando por su libertad, por su dignidad y por su soberanía.
In 1901, Cuba was allowed to take its first steps towards freedom. 400 years of Spanish colonial rule had ended, but Cuba's future was as uncertain then as it is today. The concept of democracy that the United States brought to the island was entirely new to Cubans. and harder to implement than we can imagine today. And should Cuba begin to waver, U.S. soldiers stood ready to take over the island again. And so, since the times of Pulitzer and Hearst, since the USS Maine disaster, the Spanish-American War, and the U.S. occupation, relations between the United States and Cuba have never been free of tension.